So here we are on this beautiful lake in northern Minnesota on the edge of the Boundary Waters. And it got me thinking about back when I was young and how my love for canoeing got kind of instilled in me. And I think early on, the wise people that taught me to canoe gave me some of the foundational practices that little did I know at that time were preparing me to navigate all kinds of unthinkable circumstances that I would encounter in the future. Practices are behavioral. They're things that can be incorporated in our everyday life, and they don't rely on societal norms. They're formed and shaped by all kinds of things. For example, I was one of the few people of my friends who knew how to canoe. That happened because my family introduced me to that. So I think about behaviors and how they get framed in our everyday life. And you don't have to know why they work. And over time, they get in within you and they get kind of second nature. So much of our faith formation has come from the top down, from church out to people, rather than empowering and literally trusting God's people to live faith in their everyday lives. And what if practice is a way forward in this crazy time?
Meaning making is theological work that takes place at the intersection of our understanding of God and our lived experience. Once people made meaning by applying institutional beliefs to their personal experience. But now, meaning is made helter-skelter with loose connections to religious communities, very few resources, and little time to reflect. With Christianity a lifelong journey, making meaning is less about crafting a coherent intellectual framework and more about navigating relationships and life circumstances. Congregations assist people in making meaning as they accompany them in discovering God's activity in light of their current circumstances and a vision of abundant living. A practice-centered approach to a life of faith allows us to adjust to whatever the circumstances are. Practices become the scaffolding for this life of faith that forms, informs, and transforms our lives. Practices have embedded with them particular values. And as we engage in these practices, those values become integrated into who we are. Practicing our way into abundant living provides a way to discover a Christian way of life in this dynamic world. Congregations that engage in sacramental, incarnational, and missional practices become cruciform communities where God's people together accompany each other in this discovery. Cruciform communities engage in sacramental practices. And sacramental practices are those where God's people encounter God. They are the sign and foretaste of God's promises here on earth. They anchor, but they're also agile. They provide sanctuary for travelers or holy space to gather with other travelers in God's presence. Sanctuary is often synonymous with the physical buildings where we worship. And while those are sanctuary places, limiting sanctuary to church buildings restricts the imagination of God's people and how we as cruciform community can fashion holy spaces. You see, practices like reading scripture and prayer and engaging in the sacraments are what make environments and spaces sanctuary. Communities are sanctuary when God's people feel emotionally and relationally safe to be authentic and broken in God's presence. In these environments, God's love is palatable. Travelers can let go of the internal demands. They can name the brokenness and pain in their lives and in the world, and they can rest in God's loving arms. Because God, not pastoral leadership or physical places, make these communities sacramental. Sanctuary environments can be created wherever 2 or 3 gather in God's name. Cruciform communities are also incarnational. Relationships, not content, are the primary means for discovering a Christian way of life. Beliefs are part of forming faith, but the essence of faith is love, and love is relational. So a life of faith is centered on loving God and our neighbor. That is all relational work. Knowledge about God, about church, and a life of faith are always set within relationships, informed, formed, and transformed by God's love. The church is an instrument of God's love as it embodies God's grace and mercy. Centered and open, cruciform communities are like campfires, communities of presence for travelers to be with and for each other. Anyone can create a campfire gathering. The instructions are simple: build a fire, invite people, and then be present. A campfire's basic form makes it easily replicated. And its warmth, it draws people in, and the relational connections keep people there. Telling stories and pondering life is the simple agenda. Leadership is shared and intimacy is created as participants voice both their joys and their struggles. Campfires are powerful informal gatherings that cultivate communities of presence and are incarnate of God's love. Cruciform communities are also missional. The world needs agents of God's love. Christians join God in loving the world as they heal, tend, and reconcile through the particulars of their lives. Seeing all places as potential for life, people of faith embrace God's vision of abundant life as they engage their context and contribute to the common good. Grounded in their sacramental practices and nurtured by the incarnational relationships, travelers also need outposts or missional communities that live in solidarity with their neighbors and are dispersed throughout the world. See, outpost stations are scattered in the wilderness, and they're points along the way where people gather to seek shelter, to exchange information, and to get resources. They provide basic supplies, and they specialize in how to navigate their particular terrain. Outposts exist often within a larger, greater network. Outposts are wilderness hubs that empower travelers to navigate the dynamic contextual conditions while providing them with important information for the common good.
What would it be like to incorporate faith in everyday life, that one by one over time, and then with more and more people gathering together, new momentum and new conversations get started?
People today are longing to make meaning of their lives, God's love. And this Christian faith is central to this work.